An autistic boy, known for his brilliance, asked a question no one expected, but what really shocked everyone was that the answer came from his horse. Yes, you heard that right. What this animal did at that moment defied all logic and moved even the judges present, and the most surprising part was still to come. Stay until the end to find out how this story took an unbelievable turn. Subscribe now so you don't miss amazing stories like this. The courtroom in Lexington, Kentucky was filled to capacity that unusual afternoon. The summer heat pressed against the windows, but inside, the air conditioning kept everyone comfortable enough to focus on the proceedings. What had begun as a local dispute over a contested property line had escalated into a case that captured national attention, not only because of the prominent figures involved, but also because of an unexpected element that would emerge during the trial. At the center of the room sat 12-year-old Ethan Whitaker, a boy with autism whose exceptional intelligence had been documented in several academic journals. His fingers moved restlessly on his lap as his eyes scanned the room, taking in details that most would overlook. Beside him stood Thunder, his imposing chestnut thoroughbred, a majestic creature that shouldn't have been there at all, but a special petition, supported by medical experts who testified to the therapeutic relationship between Ethan and his horse, had allowed the animal's presence. Judge Martha Sullivan, a stern woman with over 30 years of experience on the bench, had initially opposed the idea. "This is a court of law, not a petting zoo," she had declared. But Dr. Sarah Jenkins, Ethan's neuropsychologist, had been persuasive. "Your Honor, Ethan processes information differently than most people. His connection with Thunder allows him to communicate in ways he otherwise couldn't. Their relationship is not just emotional support, it's a cognitive symbiosis." The judge had reluctantly agreed, though not without strict conditions. The horse was to remain stationary beside Ethan, handled by a professional trainer, and would be removed at the first sign of disruption. The defendant, Richard Harmon, sat confidently at his table. A real estate developer with political ambitions, he had been accused of fabricating evidence to push an elderly couple, the Johnsons, off their land. His attorney, Lawrence Phillips, was one of the most expensive in the state, known for aggressive tactics and an impressive record of victories. "The defense calls Jason Miller to the stand," Phillips announced. Miller, Harmon's business partner, took the oath and settled into the witness chair. His testimony painted Harmon as a misunderstood businessman who had simply been following proper legal channels. "Mr. Harmon has always conducted his business with integrity," Miller stated firmly. "On the day in question, we were nowhere near the Johnson property. We were at the horse show in Louisville, as several witnesses can confirm." As Miller spoke, Ethan's expression changed subtly. His head tilted slightly, and he scribbled something in a notebook his mother had given him. Thunder, who had been standing quietly, suddenly stamped his right hoof against the floor 3 times in a rhythmic pattern. The sound drew attention. Judge Sullivan frowned, clearly reconsidering her decision to allow the animal in her courtroom. But Ethan raised his hand, something he rarely did in public settings. "Your Honor," his mother, Elizabeth Whitaker, spoke softly. "Ethan has something he wants to say." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Proceed, but briefly." Ethan stood, his voice clear despite his usual difficulty with verbal communication. "Mr. Miller says they were at the Louisville Horse Show on May 12th, but Thunder was there too. Thunder remembers him, but not Mr. Harmon." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Phillips rose immediately. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A child claiming his horse remembers something? This is precisely why animals don't belong in courtrooms." Judge Sullivan raised her hand for silence. "Young man, are you suggesting that your horse is contradicting the witness's testimony?" Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving Miller. "Thunder recognizes people he's met before," He has a specific reaction. His ears flick forward and he shifts his weight to his left side. He did that when Mr. Miller walked in, but when Mr. Harmon came in, there was no recognition. The prosecutor, Amanda Chen, who had been quietly observing, leaned forward. "Your Honor, while I understand the defense's concerns, I'd like to explore this further. The Louisville show was documented extensively. If Mr. Harmon wasn't there as claimed, that's relevant to his alibi." Judge Sullivan considered for a moment. "I'll allow limited questioning, Ms. Chen, but this court will not base its decisions on a horse's supposed memories." As Chen approached Ethan, Thunder stamped his hoof again, this time in a different pattern. Ethan's eyes widened, and he quickly wrote something down. "What is it, Ethan?" Chen asked gently. "Thunder is trying to tell me something about the water," Ethan replied. "There was no water at the horse show that day. The usual trough by the east entrance was removed for repairs." Miller's expression flickered momentarily, a micro-expression of concern that was noticed by several members of the jury. Chen turned to Miller. "Mr. Miller, in your earlier deposition, you stated that you and Mr. Harmon met by the eastern water trough at the Louisville show. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Miller hesitated, his confidence visibly shaken. "I might have confused the location. It was months ago." Harmon, watching from the defense table, shifted uncomfortably. His previous assurance seemed to be fading. As Chen continued her questioning, Thunder made another sound, a soft nickering that caused Ethan to look up sharply. "He's remembering something else," Ethan said. "Something about the smell." Judge Sullivan sighed. "Young man, we cannot base testimony on what your horse supposedly smells or remembers." But Ethan persisted, his voice gaining strength. "The smell of cedar. Thunder associates Mr. Miller with cedar. The only place with cedar at the show was the new VIP section." Miller paled slightly. "Yes, I was in the VIP section, which requires a special pass," Chen noted, pulling out a document. "According to the show records, you had a VIP pass, but Mr. Harmon did not. So how could you both have met by a non-existent water trough in a section that only you had access to?" The courtroom fell silent. Harmon's attorney tried to object, but the damage was done. The jury had seen Miller's reaction, and doubt had been cast on his testimony. During the recess that followed, Elizabeth Whitaker hugged her son tightly. "You did well, Ethan, but how did you know about the water trough?" Ethan patted Thunder's neck affectionately. "I didn't. Thunder did. He has a special reaction to water sources at shows. It's part of his training. When Mr. Miller mentioned the trough, Thunder didn't show that reaction because there was no trough there that day." Across the courtroom, Harmon was engaged in a heated, whispered conversation with his attorney. Their carefully constructed alibi was beginning to unravel, and it had happened in the most unexpected way imaginable, through the observational skills of a boy and his horse. As the afternoon session began, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted. What had seemed like a straightforward case with a predictable outcome now held an element of uncertainty. Ethan sat quietly beside Thunder, apparently unaware of the impact he had made. But those watching closely could see that his hand rested purposefully on his notebook, ready to record any other insights his unusual partnership might reveal. The following morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. News of the unusual developments had spread, drawing curious spectators and media from neighboring states. Judge Sullivan had considered barring cameras from the courtroom, but ultimately decided that transparency would serve justice best in this increasingly public case. Ethan arrived with Thunder at precisely 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before proceedings were scheduled to begin. Elizabeth Whitaker had dressed her son in a neatly pressed blue shirt and khaki pants, but Ethan had insisted on wearing his lucky red bow tie, a sensory comfort item that helped him manage the overwhelming stimuli of the courtroom. "Remember, honey?" Elizabeth whispered as they took their seats. "You don't have to speak unless you want to. Dr. Jenkins says we can leave any time it gets too much." Ethan nodded, but seemed more focused than anxious. He pulled out a new notebook. His previous one had been filled with detailed observations from yesterday's proceedings, and began making notes about the positions of everyone in the room. At the defense table, Richard Harmon appeared more composed than he had been at the end of yesterday's session. His attorney, Phillips, had clearly coached him on maintaining a confident demeanor regardless of the testimony. Yet, there was something different about his posture, a subtle rigidity that hadn't been there before. Prosecutor Chen entered with purpose, carrying several new folders that hadn't been part of yesterday's materials. She nodded respectfully toward Judge Sullivan, then smiled briefly at Ethan and his mother. "The prosecution calls Elizabeth Whitaker to the stand," Chen announced once the session began. As Ethan's mother took the oath, Thunder shifted slightly beside Ethan. The movement was subtle, but Ethan immediately wrote something in his notebook. "Mrs. Whitaker," Chen began, "could you tell the court about Ethan's relationship with Thunder?" Elizabeth straightened in her chair. "Ethan met Thunder 3 years ago when he was 9. It was at a therapeutic riding program for children with autism. The connection was immediate and extraordinary. Within weeks, Thunder was responding to Ethan in ways the instructors had never seen before." "Could you elaborate on this communication?" Chen asked. "Ethan has always been exceptionally observant, particularly with patterns that most people miss. He began to notice that Thunder's behaviors, his ear movements, the rhythm of his hoofbeats, even his breathing patterns, corresponded to specific environmental stimuli. Over time, they developed a kind of language." Phillips stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This is venturing into pseudoscience." "I'm not claiming anything supernatural," Elizabeth clarified before the judge could rule. "It's about pattern recognition. Ethan can interpret Thunder's natural responses in a way that provides information that can be verified independently." Judge Sullivan nodded. "I'll allow it, but keep to observable facts, Mrs. Whitaker." Elizabeth continued, explaining how Ethan had once located a lost child at a county fair by interpreting Thunder's reactions to familiar scents, and how he had predicted a sudden storm an hour before meteorologists updated their forecasts. "Based on Thunder's behavior, and these interpretations, they've been tested?" Chen asked. "Yes. Dr. Jenkins has documented dozens of instances where Ethan's interpretations were later confirmed by objective evidence." As Elizabeth spoke, Ethan continued writing in his notebook, occasionally glancing up at Harmon, who was trying to maintain his composed expression but was now drumming his fingers lightly on the table, a detail that did not escape Ethan's notice. After Elizabeth's testimony, Chen called Dr. Sarah Jenkins to the stand. The neuropsychologist brought a scientific perspective to Ethan's abilities, explaining how his autism manifested not as a disability, but as a different way of processing information. Ethan's brain forms connections that neurotypical brains might miss, Dr. Jenkins explained. His relationship with Thunder has become a conduit for this unique perception. The horse responds to environmental cues on a purely instinctual level, and Ethan interprets these responses through the lens of his exceptional pattern recognition. Phillips cross-examined Dr. Jenkins aggressively, trying to discredit the scientific basis of her claims. "Doctor, isn't it more likely that the boy is simply projecting his own perceptions onto the animal's random behaviors?" Dr. Jenkins remained composed. "I've tested that hypothesis extensively, Mr. Phillips. In controlled environments, Ethan's interpretations have proven accurate at a rate that far exceeds statistical probability. We've documented this in peer-reviewed research." Thunder suddenly nickered softly and shifted his weight. Ethan's pencil moved rapidly across his notebook. Phillips noticed. "Your Honor, the boy is clearly being coached by these noises. This is exactly why animals should not be permitted in court. Judge Sullivan turned to Ethan. Young man, what did you just write down? Ethan looked up, his expression earnest. Thunder noticed that Mr. Harmon's heart rate increased when Dr. Jenkins mentioned testing. Horses can detect heart rates from across a room. They're prey animals, so they're sensitive to the physiology of potential predators. The courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Sullivan seemed momentarily at a loss. How could you possibly know Mr. Harmon's heart rate? Phillips demanded. I don't, Ethan replied simply. Thunder does. When a nearby human's heart rate increases significantly, Thunder's right ear flicks forward and back in a specific pattern. He just did that while looking directly at Mr. Harmon. Chen seized the moment. Your Honor, while we can't verify the heart rate observation directly, we can note that Mr. Harmon appears to be perspiring and his complexion has reddened considerably in the last few minutes. Harmon, now visibly uncomfortable, loosened his tie slightly. His attorney leaned over to whisper something, but the damage had been done. The jury members were exchanging glances, several of them now watching Harmon with increased scrutiny. After the lunch recess, Chen introduced new evidence, surveillance footage from a gas station near the Johnson property, taken on the day Harmon claimed to be in Louisville. The timestamp shows 2:17 p.m., Chen noted, as the grainy video played on the courtroom screens. This is approximately 20 minutes after Mr. Miller claims he and Mr. Harmon were at the VIP section of the horse show. The footage wasn't definitive. It showed a vehicle similar to Harmon's entering the gas station, but the driver's face wasn't clearly visible. This proves nothing, Phillips argued. That could be anyone's vehicle. As the debate continued, Thunder suddenly stamped his hoof 3 times in quick succession. Ethan's eyes widened and he raised his hand. Judge Sullivan, perhaps against her better judgment, acknowledged him. Yes, Ethan? The license plate, Ethan said, pointing to the screen where the video was paused. The first characters are TK7. That's Mr. Harmon's personalized plate. It stands for the King 7 because he owns 7 properties in Kings Valley. Phillips scoffed. How could the boy possibly know that? Because we saw Mr. Harmon's car at the Montgomery farm 2 months ago, Ethan explained. Thunder and I were there for a therapy session. The car was parked near the stable. I remember license plates. It's something my brain does automatically. Chen turned to Harmon. Mr. Harmon, is TK7 your license plate number? Before Phillips could object, Harmon nodded stiffly. Yes, but that doesn't mean... No further questions at this time, Your Honor, Chen interrupted smoothly. She returned to her table, allowing the implications to settle over the courtroom like a fine mist. As the afternoon session continued, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Ethan remained focused, his connection with Thunder seemingly strengthening. As the proceedings unfolded, for those watching closely, it was becoming apparent that the unusual duo wasn't just a curiosity. They were becoming the linchpin in a case that was growing more complex by the hour. By the 3rd day of the trial, the Johnson property dispute had transformed into something much larger. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, and social media buzzed with hashtags like Chung Horse Whisperer and Autism Justice. Inside, Judge Sullivan had been forced to impose stricter rules to maintain order as the gallery swelled with spectators, eager to witness what many were calling the miracle on Main Street. Ethan seemed unaffected by the attention, though Elizabeth had arranged for noise-canceling headphones to help him manage when the courtroom became too loud. Thunder, displaying the remarkable discipline that had made him a champion before becoming Ethan's companion, remained calm despite the unusual environment. A veterinarian had been permitted to check on the horse during each recess, confirming that he showed no signs of distress. Richard Harmon, however, was showing visible strain. His usual crisp appearance had faded. His shirt collar was slightly rumpled, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. His attorney, Phillips, maintained his aggressive stance, but those familiar with his methods could tell he was on the defensive. "The defense calls Richard Harmon to the stand," Phillips announced as the morning session began. As Harmon took the oath, Thunder's ears pricked forward, a detail that Ethan immediately recorded in his notebook. Judge Sullivan, who had been observing the boy carefully, noticed his increased attention. "Mr. Harmon," Phillips began, "could you please tell the court in your own words where you were on May 12th of this year?" Harmon cleared his throat. "As I've stated previously, I was at the Louisville Triple Crown qualifying show with Jason Miller. We were there to support several riders whose families have invested in our development projects." "And at what time did you arrive at the show?" "Around 10:30 in the morning. We stayed until approximately 4 p.m. Phillips nodded confidently. "The prosecution has attempted to use gas station footage to suggest you were elsewhere. How do you explain this?" "My vehicle is a common model, a black Ford Explorer. Thousands of them are registered in Kentucky alone, and TK7 is my vanity plate, yes, but the footage is too blurry to confirm those exact characters." As Harmon spoke, Thunder shifted his weight and blew air forcefully through his nostrils. Ethan wrote something down, then gently stroked the horse's neck to calm him. Phillips continued building Harmon's defense, establishing character witnesses and highlighting his contributions to the community. Throughout, Thunder remained unusually alert, his ears constantly adjusting position in a way that Ethan seemed to find significant. When Chen began her cross-examination, she took an unexpected approach. "Mr. Harmon, you've testified that you were at the horse show all day. During that time, did you ever enter the main exhibition hall?" Harmon nodded. "Yes, of course. That's where the primary events were held." "And would you describe the hall for us? The layout, the seating, the general atmosphere?" Phillips frowned. "Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. I'm establishing Mr. Harmon's familiarity with a location he claims to have spent several hours in," Chen explained. Judge Sullivan considered. "I'll allow it. The witness will answer." Harmon described the hall in general terms, the central ring, the tiered seating, the judge's stand. As he spoke, Thunder became increasingly restless, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "And the lighting," Chen pressed. "What was the lighting like in the hall that day?" "Standard arena lighting," Harmony replied, a hint of irritation creeping into his voice. "Bright overhead fixtures, nothing unusual." Thunder suddenly stamped 3 times in quick succession. Ethan's hand shot up. Judge Sullivan hesitated, then nodded. "Ethan, do you have something to add?" "The main hall was being renovated that week," Ethan said, his voice clear and steady. "The regular lighting had been removed and they were using temporary construction lights on stands. It created unusual shadows that spooked some of the horses. Thunder remembers because one of the lights fell over during the 3rd competition." Chen turned back to Harmon. "Is that accurate, Mr. Harmon?" Harmon's confident facade cracked slightly. "I don't recall the specific lighting arrangement." Chen pulled out a file. "I have here the incident report from the Louisville show management, documenting a fallen light fixture at approximately 2:30 p.m. on May 12th, which caused a 15-minute delay in proceedings. It was, apparently, quite memorable." As Chen continued her methodical questioning, Ethan leaned forward, watching Harmon with intense focus. Thunder, picking up on his companion's concentration, remained perfectly still except for the occasional ear twitch that Ethan carefully noted. During a brief recess, Elizabeth found Chen in the hallway. "Amanda, there's something you should know." Ethan believes Thunder is reacting to something specific about Mr. Harmon, something beyond just the inconsistencies in his testimony. Chen looked intrigued. "What kind of reaction?" "It's a pattern Thunder shows when he detects fear, specifically fear associated with a familiar place or object. Ethan says it's very distinctive." When court resumed, Chen appeared to have adjusted. Her strategy. She began showing photographs of the Johnson property, including aerial views of the disputed boundary line. "Mr. Harmon, have you ever visited the Johnson property personally?" "Only from the public road," Harmon replied smoothly. "As I've stated, my interest was purely professional and conducted through proper channels." Chen displayed another photograph, this one showing a distinctive oak tree at the edge of the Johnson land. "And this landmark, are you familiar with it?" "It appears to be a tree at the property line. I've seen it in the surveys." As the photograph remained on screen, thunder began to make a soft, nickering sound. Ethan's pencil moved rapidly across his page. After a moment, he raised his hand again. Judge Sullivan, who had seemingly resigned herself to the unusual dynamics of her courtroom, acknowledged him. "Yes, Ethan." "Thunder recognizes that tree," Ethan said. "He's displaying the same pattern he shows when we return to a place we've visited before. It's different from his reaction to seeing a photograph of a place he hasn't been." Harmon's attorney stood immediately. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A horse cannot possibly distinguish between photographs of places it has or hasn't visited." Dr. Jenkins, who was seated behind Elizabeth, spoke up. "Actually, Your Honor, with permission, I can clarify. Horses have excellent recognition memory, particularly for locations associated with emotional experiences. While Thunder isn't reading the photograph, he's responding to Ethan's focus on it and connecting it to a memory of his own." Judge Sullivan sighed. "Dr. Jenkins, are you suggesting that this horse remembers being at the location shown in the photograph?" "I'm suggesting it's entirely possible, especially if the visit was accompanied by some unusual circumstance that would make it memorable to the animal." Chen turned back to Harmon, whose composure was visibly deteriorating. "Mr. Harmon, I'll ask you again. Have you ever visited the Johnson property, specifically the area around this oak tree?" Before Harmon could answer, Thunder stamped his hoof forcefully and tossed his head. Ethan stood up suddenly, his eyes wide. "He was there at night," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly with the effort of translating his understanding. "Thunder remembers the smell of the tree and the sound of digging. He was scared because there were no lights except for a flashlight." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Judge Sullivan gavelled for order, but the damage was done. Harmon's face had drained of color, and he was staring at Thunder with an expression that bordered on fear. "Your Honor," Chen said when order was restored, "in light of this revelation, the prosecution requests permission to introduce new evidence, soil, samples taken from the disputed boundary line, which show recent disturbance inconsistent with natural erosion." As the legal battle intensified, Ethan remained focused on Thunder, who had calmed after his outburst but was still watching Harmon intently. The truth, buried beneath layers of deception, was slowly working its way to the surface, guided by the most unlikely of partnerships. The final day of the trial dawned with a sense of anticipation that extended far beyond the Lexington courthouse. What had begun as a local property dispute had captured the nation's imagination, sparking conversations about alternative forms of communication, the capabilities of those with autism, and the complex relationship between humans and animals. For Ethan, however, it was simply another day of observation and interpretation. He arrived wearing the same red bow tie, but had added his lucky blue socks, a sign that Elizabeth recognized as his way of preparing for something important. Thunder seemed especially alert this morning, his ears constantly moving, catching sounds that others might miss. Richard Harmon entered the courtroom, looking defeated before the proceedings had even begun. His attorney, Phillips, maintained a professional demeanor, but the confident swagger of earlier sessions had disappeared. They had requested a private meeting with the judge and prosecutor before the day's session, but whatever had been discussed hadn't improved Harmon's spirits. Judge Sullivan called the court to order with a solemn expression. Before we continue with testimony, I understand the defense has a statement. Phillips stood. Yes, Your Honor. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, my client wishes to amend his previous testimony. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Elizabeth placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder, but the boy didn't seem surprised. He had written something in his notebook just moments before Phillips had spoken. Mr. Harmon would like to acknowledge that there were inaccuracies in his earlier statements regarding his whereabouts on May 12th. Phillips continued. He was in fact present at the Johnson property that evening, but maintains that his actions were misinterpreted. Prosecutor Chen rose. Your Honor, in light of this admission, the prosecution would like to enter into evidence the results of the soil analysis from the property boundary, which indicates that survey markers were deliberately removed and repositioned. Judge Sullivan nodded. Proceed, Ms. Chen. As Chen presented the technical evidence, soil disturbance patterns, metallurgical analysis of marker fragments, photographic comparisons of the boundary line before and after May 12th, Ethan watched Thunder carefully. The horse remained calm but attentive, occasionally shifting his gaze between Harmon and the evidence being displayed. The prosecution calls Ethan Whitaker to the stand, Chen announced when she had finished presenting the forensic evidence. A hush fell over the courtroom. This was unexpected. No one had anticipated that Ethan would testify formally. Elizabeth looked concerned, but after a whispered conversation with Dr. Jenkins, she nodded her approval. Your Honor, Phillips interjected, we must object to this. The boy's testimony has been irregular from the start, and now to formalize it seems inappropriate. Judge Sullivan considered for a moment. I understand your concerns, Mr. Phillips, but I'm going to allow this. The court will give appropriate weight to the testimony based on its substantive content, not on the unusual manner in which it was initially presented. She turned to Ethan. Young man, do you understand what it means to tell the truth in court? Ethan nodded solemnly. Yes, Your Honor. It means to say what really happened, not what you wish happened or what someone else wants you to say happened. Very good. And you'll do that today? Yes, ma'am. As Ethan was sworn in, arrangements were made for Thunder to be positioned where Ethan could still see him. Dr. Jenkins had explained that maintaining this visual connection would help Ethan stay regulated in the stressful environment. Chen approached gently. Ethan, could you explain to the court how you and Thunder communicate? Ethan straightened in his chair. Thunder doesn't use words like people do, but he communicates through patterns of movement, sounds, and reactions to his environment. His ears tell me what he's focusing on. His breathing shows his level of comfort, and his hooves signal when something is important. And have you and Thunder been to the Johnson property before this trial? Yes, twice. Once during a trail ride last summer. The Johnsons let therapy riders use their back trails, and once on May 12th, though we weren't supposed to be there then. The courtroom fell silent. Even Chen seemed taken aback by this direct confirmation. Could you tell us about May 12th? She asked carefully. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. Mom had a migraine, so our neighbor Mrs. Blake took me for Thunder's evening exercise. We usually stay on the community trails, but Thunder was extra energetic, so we went further than usual and ended up near the Johnson property around twilight. He paused, collecting his thoughts. We saw headlights on the property, which was strange, because the Johnsons were away visiting their daughter. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that. Mrs. Blake thought we should check if everything was okay, so we rode closer. What did you see, Ethan? Two men with flashlights by the big oak tree. They were digging around the property marker, the metal post with the orange cap. Thunder got nervous because one of the men was agitated. Horses can sense emotional states better than people can. It's how they survived in the wild. Did you recognize these men? Chen asked. Not then. It was too dark and we stayed back in the trees. Mrs. Blake was worried about interfering, so we left quietly. But when Mr. Harmon walked into the courtroom on the first day, Thunder recognized his scent and his movements. That's when I realized he was one of the men we saw. Phillips stood. "Your Honor, this is hearsay based on a child's imagination and an animal's supposed memory. It cannot be considered reliable testimony." Judge Sullivan looked thoughtful. "Mr. Phillips, while I understand your objection, we also have Mr. Harmon's admission that he was at the property that evening, which corroborates this account. The witness may continue." Ethan described how Thunder had different reactions to Harmon and Miller because he had only seen Harmon at the property that night. He explained the specific patterns in Thunder's behavior that indicated recognition, fear, and location-based memory. When Thunder saw the photograph of the oak tree, he displayed the same ear and breathing pattern he shows whenever we pass a place where something frightening happened. Horses have excellent location memory. It's evolutionary. They need to remember where the dangerous places are. As Ethan's testimony continued, even those who had been skeptical found themselves captivated by the methodical way he interpreted Thunder's behaviors and connected them to verifiable facts. Dr. Jenkins occasionally added context to help the court understand the scientific basis for Ethan's observations, lending credibility to what might otherwise have seemed fantastical. After Ethan's testimony, Harmon requested to address the court directly. His admission was reluctant but comprehensive. He had indeed altered the property markers to support his development plans, believing the elderly Johnsons wouldn't notice or would be unable to fight his legal team. The detailed testimony of Ethan and Thunder, combined with the forensic evidence, had made his position untenable. Judge Sullivan's ruling was decisive. The property rights were affirmed to the Johnsons, and Harmon faced significant penalties for tampering with legal boundary markers and presenting false testimony. The judicial system, which had initially been skeptical of Ethan's unusual contribution, had ultimately embraced the truth it revealed. In the days that followed, as national attention turned to the implications of the case, Ethan returned to his normal routine with Thunder. They rode the familiar trails, practiced their communication patterns, and continued the therapy sessions that benefited them both. For Ethan, the courtroom drama had been an unexpected application of the skills he had developed naturally. For Thunder, it had simply been another opportunity to communicate with the human who understood him best. Elizabeth found her son in the stable one evening, 2 weeks after the trial concluded. Ethan was sitting on a bale of hay, showing Thunder a newspaper clipping about the case. "The article says we help change people's minds about autism and animals," Ethan said, looking up at his mother. "But we were just telling the truth, weren't we?" Elizabeth smiled, sitting beside him. "Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is exactly that. Tell the truth as we see it, even when others might not understand how we see it." Thunder nickered softly and nudged Ethan's shoulder with his muzzle. Ethan's hand moved automatically to stroke the horse's neck, his fingers finding the precise spot that always seemed to comfort them both. "He says we should go riding tomorrow," Ethan translated, a small smile forming on his lips. "The weather will be perfect." Elizabeth didn't question how her son knew about tomorrow's weather forecast or what Thunder was actually communicating. She had learned that there were many forms of understanding in the world, and that wisdom sometimes came from the most unexpected sources. As the sunset painted the stable in warm, golden light, she was simply grateful for the extraordinary partnership that had brought justice not only to the Johnsons, but to all those who had ever been dismissed or underestimated. The case of Ethan Whitaker and Thunder became a landmark in Kentucky legal history, not because of its complexity or the prominence of those involved, but because it had demonstrated that truth could find its way to the surface through the most unexpected channels. Law schools began including it in their ethics curriculum. Therapeutic riding programs experienced a surge in support, and researchers devoted new attention to the capabilities of those on the autism spectrum. For Judge Martha Sullivan, who had initially resisted the unconventional arrangement in her courtroom, the experience had been transformative. At her retirement ceremony the following year, she cited the Harmon case as the most enlightening of her career. "The law," she told the assembled crowd, "is ultimately about finding truth. Sometimes that truth comes to us in ways we never anticipated, through voices we might not have thought to listen to. The wisdom I gained from that unusual partnership between a boy and his horse has changed how I view evidence, testimony, and perhaps most importantly, how I understand communication itself." The Johnsons, whose modest property had been at the center of the controversy, invited Ethan and Thunder to visit whenever they wished. The old oak tree at the boundary, once the site of deception, became instead a symbol of revelation, a place where truth had literally been unearthed through the most unexpected alliance. Dear listeners, we hope that Ethan and Thunder's remarkable journey has touched your hearts and minds. Their story reminds us that wisdom can come from unexpected places, and that sometimes the most powerful truths are whispered to those who know how to listen. For more captivating stories that explore extraordinary connections between humans and animals, we've prepared a special playlist. Find it by clicking the link on your left. If you enjoyed this tale of perception, courage, and justice, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique narratives that challenge our understanding of communication, ability, and truth. What unexpected partnerships have you witnessed that revealed important truths? We can't wait to read your thoughts in the comments section below.